Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. Last episode, we explored what China, Russia, and the United States want geopolitically, both in the near term and the long term. It was clear from this discussion that there is little space where the interests of these nations cross over. As a result, a grand bargain between the nations is unlikely. However, today we're going to explore what a world after a grand bargain could look like. We're going to do this purely to explain why a grand bargain is so unlikely. So let's dive in. Based on the historical examples of grand bargains that we discussed last week, in some occurrences, we saw that the geopolitical environment was balanced. The concept of Europe and the Peace of Westphalia were such examples of this. In other situations, the geopolitical relationship between the relevant actors was imbalanced. As such, the stronger nation had the capabilities to impose and uphold a deal on other geopolitical actors that benefited them individually. The end of World War II and the end of the Cold War were two such examples. Finally, in the US-China strategic deal under Nixon, they both benefited from making a deal that weakened another geopolitical power that they both saw as a bigger threat, that being the Soviet Union. Of these three examples, our world today best resembles one where two nations can benefit from a deal that weakens another geopolitical power that is a bigger threat. This principle is the foundation of Russia and China's long-term geopolitical moves, and it will continue to be so. Cooperation between the Russians and the Chinese doesn't resemble a grand bargain in itself. But when looking at previous historical grand bargains, our world today is also one that is unbalanced when it comes to power. What makes this world more complicated than those of the past is that power can be defined today by a range of domains of modern day competition. In some domains, the balance of power is clearer than in others, but generally, the world today is unbalanced when it comes to power. For example, the United States holds the world's global reserve currency, the US dollar. This gives it immense financial power to pursue sanctions and confiscate reserves. These are moves that the United States has made against Russia. In fact, this move prompted many nations to hedge exposure to the United States and the dollar, beginning what could be the very slow psychological decline of the strength of the dollar over many decades. When it comes to China, they have power when it comes to rare earth elements. They mine 70% of all rare earth elements and process 90%. This is one part of the United States' latest push for resiliency. It's so China doesn't hold a powerful card such as this one. Now, these geopolitical moves often unfold quietly in the background, but they are the biggest narratives that should be explored when it comes to the relationships between these superpowers. This is because these narratives determine the long-term moves these nations will make, and these long-term moves are what have the biggest consequence on the future direction of our geopolitical world. Our world today is unbalanced across a range of domains of modern-day competition because our world is growing in complexity. This naturally makes geopolitical relationships more complex, and it hinders the likelihood that a grand bargain will occur across all these domains of modern-day competition at the same time. Also, as I discussed earlier, Russia and China benefit from their cooperation in the pursuit of a rise of the multipolar world. This ultimately undermines the United States. In any grand bargain, or even in a partial deal, Russia and China will want to continue this multipolar rise, while the United States would effectively hand over part of the geopolitical world to build strength and resiliency in other areas. This is the only way that I can see a grand bargain occurring, but why would the United States do this? Well, when geopolitical powers begin to decline, they often overstretch across a range of areas. They waste resources attempting to maintain influence in areas where it could be better to cut their losses. This was clear to the British Empire, which overstretched militarily and with the territory it held as a part of the empire. This decline took decades to unfold, but the signs of decline also existed for decades. In some ways, the United States is showing signs of decline relative to its own previous strength today, such as in education, in its debt levels, and in internal political tension being elevated. Now, for the United States and Trump today, he believed that the United States was overstretching in Europe. He pushed for NATO members to hit 5% of GDP on defence spending, because in his opinion, many nations were cruising along, exporting their security and defence to the United States, which itself was paying for it out of its own pocket. The reality is likely somewhere in between, but what's important is that this is one such example of Trump pulling the United States back from some of its geopolitical obligations, with the main aim of this being to strengthen the United States' own backyard. This is the approach of the Don Roe Doctrine, and it supports the United States' moves against Greenland, Cuba, Ecuador, Mexico, Colombia, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and Bolivia, amongst others. Eventually, the aim of this strategy is that the United States can build a strong backyard, and it can then restrict China's rise from a position of strength. But this will ultimately be a long-term approach. For now, with the United States pulling back, other nations around the world received a wake-up call. Either these nations also seek to build resiliency themselves, or they risk being influenced by the superpowers of the world. As for Russia and China, the United States pulling back from obligations allows them to push for the continued rise of a multipolar world, especially in areas where the United States might pull back. The United States' continued pursuit to build resiliency, and Russia and China's consistent push for the rise of a multipolar world don't require a geopolitical grand bargain at all, because these trends are already unfolding. In fact, I'd argue that a grand bargain would actually disadvantage Russia and China, which can naturally move to gain or consolidate strength in areas of modern-day competition where the United States pulls back. This is especially true for the Chinese. Ultimately, time and momentum are on their side when it comes to the rise of a multipolar world, and they don't have to give anything up as a part of a grand bargain. They just have to be patient while the United States makes aggressive moves to boost resiliency. Nations also outside of Russia and China want greater global representation in the world, and so this trend of a rising multipolar world won't decline anytime soon. Also, Russia and China have time on their side. It is worth noting that these strategies to boost resiliency might not work for the United States. The principle from the art of war to not interrupt your enemy while he's in the process of ruining himself could be valid here. It's questionable why Russia and China would attempt to interfere with this through a deal. In short, they wouldn't. This reaffirms to me that these three nations aren't incentivized to pursue a grand deal together at all. Now, our world today is the most complex geopolitical environment in history. We're living in a multipolar world where market share is up for grabs across a range of realms of modern-day geopolitical competition. Calculating how a grand bargain would affect each of these areas of competition is an incredibly difficult pursuit, but it's a pursuit that any nation signing such a grand bargain would have to undertake. From this current environment of low trust and low cooperation between the United States and China especially, the idea of a grand bargain currently seems very far away in reality. Now, the idea behind these grand bargain scenarios that have recently been circulating is that artificial intelligence will open up many areas of innovation where cooperation will be incentivized. The optimistic scenario then leads to cooperation in quantum computing, nuclear fusion, space exploration, drug research, biotechnology, agriculture, robotics, synthetic materials, and further in AI itself, because the belief in this optimistic scenario is that these nations will achieve more working together than against each other. But during World War II, the opposite occurred. The Manhattan Project saw what happens when nations can imagine the tools that will determine the future of our geopolitical world order. This is due to the power that these tools often provide the holder. The pursuit of nuclear weapons has played a part in determining the structure of our geopolitical world order ever since. So, as we look to the future, will nations kindly share these tools and cooperate for the sake of innovation? Or will they compete and enter into conflict to control them? Unfortunately, I'd argue that the latter is more probable. We're currently seeing this today in the AI push for data centers, especially in the United States, but there are also recent reports that China is pursuing a $295 billion data center build-out. While modern technologies may see more international collaboration than nuclear weapons did, history suggests that nations rarely share breakthroughs in technology that could hinder their strategic advantages. And so we remain in a world of competition and conflict where power is up for grabs. And as of today, no side seems incentivized to accept a grand bargain. Firstly, because their interests don't overlap, and secondly, because any deal would likely weaken them in some areas. In fact, the interests and incentives of the superpowers are, in many ways, polar opposites. China wants to maintain its market share in rare earths, while the United States wants to reduce China's market share in rare earths. This is one such isolated example, but many others exist. And until this changes, competition and conflict will remain the name of the geopolitical game. Now, to conclude this series on grand bargains, last week I said that this optimistic vision can't take the place of the reality of our geopolitical world, and I hope that this episode today can paint such an image. When it comes to the criteria under which grand bargains occur, in our world today, the major powers are far from exhausted. The distribution of power remains unclear, and each major power wouldn't gain more from a deal. As a result, we continue to exist in this world where lines are shifting, and we will remain in this world until the conditions for a deal or a grand bargain are clear to see. This would be the major powers being exhausted, the distribution of power being clear, or cross-domain trade-offs being pursued, and each major power taking part in such a grand bargain would gain more through a deal than they would through the continuation of this current world of competition and conflict. None of these criteria can be seen today. Now, looking towards next episode, there is one final thread that I've purposefully not discussed today, and that is all the other nations in the world. We've recently seen Iran holding Trump hostage in a conflict that he wants out of. Russia is being held on the ground in a stalemated conflict and is being hurt by Ukrainian drone attacks, and China likely won't make physical moves against Taiwan because it too would be rooted in a conflict that would hurt it. These are only a few examples of how other nations are rising in their ability to challenge the superpowers of today. Naturally, as our world grows more complex, there are more tools with which a nation can be hurt, and other nations outside of geopolitical superpowers can often possess these strengths. It's this idea that we'll discuss in next episode. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on the podcast platform of your choice. It really helps out the podcast. I've been Dylan, and I'll talk to you next time.